This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
My name is Jay Carson. I'm your host today, filling in for our fearless leader, Mike Baranowski. I'm joined today by Justin Holmes, professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning, Jay.
How was your week? How are things in Northern Iowa? Cold, I'm betting.
It was like record warm yesterday, and then it dropped about 50 degrees, and so yeah, it's real cold.
Okay.
It's colder than inaugural cold. So
yeah, winter is coming.
Winter is coming,
especially yes. So today on the show, we're going to start off with the discussion on the LA fires and sort of the political fallout there. I think in discussing something like this, obviously the first thing that any of us should mention is hearts go out to those affected by the fires, those who have lost everything. I have family out there. It's difficult. So, and I think anytime you have these discussions, then on the politics of it, there's the sense that maybe are we forgetting or making light of the human element, and I want to make sure that the human element doesn't go unacknowledged. But we're a politics show, right? And that's what our job is to discuss what the politics, the political fallout can be from this. So, and also I'm cognizant of we're a little late. It's sort of a thing of when they recorded last week's show, the fires had started, but it had not developed into the story that it has been now. So we're also a little bit weird in hitting this kind of a little off the news cycle. But I think, Justin, my first thought is, there have been a lot of criticisms from the right, from Republicans, and even from some Democrats regarding just general management of one, the preparedness, to things like brush clearing, things like the next level of overall policies in California, right? The water diversion and so forth. And to go into all those, each of those would probably be a show in and of itself. But I guess, what's, and I would put on top of that sort of a layer of the Mayor Bass's being in Africa when this tragedy struck, which to me it's not, again, it's not the straw man argument of, look, had she been there, the fires wouldn't have happened. But I do think there's a layer of this is it says something about priorities, right? It's not necessarily a causality statement in that this actually happened, but it does say something about priorities when you look at the other factors that I mentioned, the overall preparedness, brush, forest management, and then other environmental issues and just how those are being handled in California statewide. So your thoughts as a Democrat or a fellow traveler,
or with the caveat that I am not an expert in firefighting,
right? And that's something that I think we wanted to kind of stay away from, right?
Which actually one of the interesting political.
Although look, I will go out on a limb and say that having the reservoirs full and being able to pump water is helpful in firefighting.
Fair enough. What I was going to say is, basically everybody last week became a firefighting expert,
right.
Apparently. So not going to add to that. For me, I think, a lot of this is, whoever was caught holding the bag was going to get blame. And I think this is one of those things, and I kind of had this response, with the hurricane, in North Carolina as well, that, a lot of this people sort of attach their favorite sort of political punching bags to and whatnot.
Well, I think that's right. No, and I think it's a valid point to make.
When, I think there's, in both cases, these are act of God sort of things, which, both in terms of the kind of prevention or causality, there's not a lot of human agency here. There's some question about where the fires started and, whether that's an electrical thing or whether it was fireworks or, whatever.
Yeah.
Hurricanes, obviously, not. But, I think people kind of grab onto whatever their sort of preferred thing that they're angry about is and blame that for kind of what happens. The other thing is that, the response to these, in both cases, I think people miss kind of the magnitude of this. There's sort of an expectation here that, these are things that are under human control in terms of an immediate response and immediately setting things right. And, I think in frankly, both of those cases, because people did sort of bring up the hurricanes at times in response to this, I think there's a lot of concern, a lot of people saying, well, gosh, why didn't you stop that? Why, et cetera, when I think a lot of it's just beyond, what you can do. I think there's a lot on some level. I think it'll take sort of some hindsight to see, what goes wrong, what doesn't. I think some of the things, just in terms of the magnitude of this, I'm not sure that there's any policy that can prepare you for them, which doesn't say you couldn't do things differently.
Well, I guess I would tend to agree. There's not a policy that you can say I can't. Well, I'll walk that back a little bit because I do want to follow up on that. But
yeah, and I suppose there's not a policy that is practically viable, on some level. I mean, you could have 500,000 firefighters, full time in Los Angeles or something, but that's not a viable sort of thing. But some of the things that are sort of pitched as failures, the water system, for example, nothing's going to maintain that sort of pressure. There's no, you're not going to have water mains where if you open them all up, open every hydrant, you're going to run out. You're not going to have pressure, et cetera. So I think, on some level, a lot of the blame that gets cast here is maybe, kind of frustration, lashing out, hey, gosh, there's got to be somebody I can blame for this. And certainly, there's some of this on the left as well. There's sort of a discussion, of police budgets versus fire budgets and things like that. And frankly, I haven't seen there's sort of a two-way argument about, whether the fire budget went up last year or not. It appears that it maybe went up a little, but it was delayed and so on. Police budget went up a lot. Again, I'm not sure that there's any amount that you can spend, on the fire budget that really mitigates this very much. So anyhow, your thoughts?
So I guess the way I would look at this, and this is sort of what I would see as sort of the irony of this in California in particular, because I think you're exactly right in that there's no policy approach that can prevent natural disasters. But in some cases, that's sort of what Democrats have been pitching for years, right? That and every time there's a natural disaster, well, it's climate change, and if you drove an electric car, we wouldn't have these natural disasters. That's, I think, very much a known sequitur, but that's been the argument for years since Obama was nominated, and
probably before that
promised to stop the tides from rising. So I think there's something to that, right? That people maybe have been oversold on what policy solutions can do. Like if we'd only signed the Paris Accords, we wouldn't have had this hurricane. We wouldn't have had these fires. I think that's nonsensical. But then I think you go down to the next level of look, if you're starting from the position that climate change is happening and it's bad and so forth, then it becomes almost more incumbent on, okay, what are we going to do about it? Right? If you know that, hey, and even sort of setting aside climate change, right? These fires have happened in California for, millions of years probably, right?
Yeah.
The difference is now we've got people living in the middle of them. And the same is true largely, I think, of hurricanes. And I think the last hurricane where it went so far inland was really an aberration, right? That you didn't necessarily see coming.
It was like up in the mountains and stuff. Yeah, that's not where you expect to get flooded. You know.
Yeah, but something like Hurricane Katrina,
sure,
right? Which I think that's sort of, I think, a good comparison. A lot of this is look, you build a city that's below sea level, that's in a place that's subject to these big storms.
Sure.
They happen. So you build up a system of levees and dikes and so forth. But, there at that point, then there's the human failure to maintain those levees and dikes that really was the biggest issue in Katrina, either to maintain them or to fortify them enough to sustain what they expected would be coming. And I think that's sort of the same logic applies to California, is that everyone knows that these fires happen. They know that more fires will happen in the future, or that's their position, right? That it's just going to get worse. But yet they don't do the blocking and tackling, if you will, right, of government, and making sure that resources are available. And look, I come from this with the conservative viewpoint that Mother Nature is bigger than us all, and this stuff happens, and the government can't control the weather and so forth. But that's sort of when the reservoir is offline and nobody knows it. That was the other weird thing of these failures of communication, that if you're living in an area that's fire prone, that someone in the mayor's office, the fire department, should have known, there's not going to be any water here. The length of time it takes to have these reservoirs offline, that's, again, it's one of those things of no, you can't stop Mother Nature, but it is fair for people to expect their governments to take certain steps to mitigate those disasters. And then there's another layer I didn't get to, right, which is sort of the insurance regulatory and piece of building them in the price of living in places that are prone to disasters, which is something we didn't necessarily have. It wasn't as much a problem, I'd say, 50, certainly not 100 years ago. But I think there's more to that now. And this sort of, you see this with the hurricanes is, often there's the statistic of this was the most expensive hurricane ever. Well, that's because every time, exactly, because we keep building bigger and better stuff right in the path of hurricanes, which as a market guy, I'm like, okay, if that's what you want to do, but here's what it's going to cost you. And I think that's, you can make that argument on hurricane places. You can make it on government subsidized flood insurance that encourages people to perhaps build places where maybe they ought not to. And I think the same goes for the insurance market in California, which is now a problem because the government sort of removed the ability of insurers to sell insurance at a profit at a rate that will keep them in business. And what happens is you have insurers leave the area. So I mean, those are completely man-made policy decisions that I think are poor ones, and there should be some more reflection on it afterwards.
Well, and I think Florida has the same insurance issue, not in the kind of government regulation area, but there are places where you just can't. Whole companies are pulling out, and I do sort of wonder, is this, if insurance rates go up so much or places are uninsurable, does that eventually get people to move? I mean, that's certainly one possibility. That said, some place like California, Los Angeles in particular, even if a fair number of people leave, it's still bizarre.
They're not going to move Los Angeles. Yeah.
They're not going to move Los Angeles. And I don't see a scenario, unless it starts burning every 3 weeks, I don't see a scenario where an appreciable number of people leave, but yeah, I think that there is sort of, this issue. I've seen speculation that my insurance rates are going to go up, and yours.
Oh, they will.
Yeah,
No,
so,
I mean, I think it is sort of spread out then throughout homeowners insurance.
And to be fair, I mean, that's how insurance works, I guess. It's a pooled risk. But yeah, I think, and certainly I saw some figures that, look like, already there's going to be a fairly large shortfall of what's covered. Forget the exact numbers, but it looked like, maybe half of the damage, half the cost of damage maybe won't be covered by, insurance. And so, that's.
Well, and let's talk about the next piece of that, because there's a related policy question there. And to some extent, the powers that be in LA and California have promised to cut red tape in terms of allowing people to build back. But a lot of places, right, the what you run into is, say you have bought some place that has an older system of whatever, and it can be, I mean, length of driveway, how the electric is buried or put in trees, right, or steel versus wood pylons. That you have that in places by the water. There are all sorts of places that existed because they were essentially grandfathered in, right?
Sure.
But with new construction, there are new requirements. And those requirements come with expenses, and that's where you get this shortfall of, well, maybe you could have rebuilt it as it was, but the state and or the city won't necessarily let you rebuild it as it was. It wants it built back better, as they say. And look, I get it. There's an argument for that you have this gradual improvement of your infrastructure and your housing stock and so forth over the years. But the problem is, one, it does, in some cases, because of the expense and the scope of the regulations, discourage investment and improvement. And two, when you get a situation like this, where you have massive destruction across a really broad range, it makes it almost impossible to rebuild according to what you're expected to rebuild. Those newer standards.
I think one thing, and actually I'm kind of relating oddly a slight connection back to myself. Where I live, there were horrible floods back in 2008, and that was the year I moved here. In fact, and it was a really bizarre. I had bought the house but hadn't moved in yet, and so I didn't even know where it was, like relative to what was underwater, and fortunately, I'm high enough that it wasn't an issue. But kind of one thing that became really apparent is sort of capacity to get work done.
Yeah.
I needed some stuff painted and some flooring and things. And, you couldn't find anybody, at all, because everybody was, involved in, rebuilding flooded stuff. So I think that's, just thinking kind of from my own relatively petty experience, this is going to be that times a million, in terms of capacity. I do think, it's a little unclear. It looked like they were giving sort of some waivers, in sort of the initial statement about certain things, at least, to kind of, speed up the building process. But I suppose, on some level, back to kind of what you were saying with government policy, earlier, it seems like a fool's errand to rebuild these things under old standards if you have, new standards that can potentially mitigate, some of the fire issues. And, it was certainly, it'll be more expensive on the individual builds. But, at the same time, if we're just going to keep building the same stuff over and over again, it was interesting.
But I guess what's the alternative, though? Either you have the money or you don't.
Well, there's that.
I mean, that's the thing. If you're insured up to X and the rebuild price is X plus 50%, you're just not going to be able to do that. And I think there would be sort of a if you tried to spread that cost out, maybe statewide, maybe it does, but California is in no position to be making that kind of putting that kind of money in statewide. If you tried to do it nationally, I think it is sort of fair for somebody in northern Iowa to say, well, why am I paying for these California standards, right?
I suppose, although, I mean, we got a bunch of money for, the floods. I mean, federal government does do these things, in terms of disaster response. So, I mean, certainly the optics are going to be bad because, nobody likes California, apparently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's one thing for disaster response. And then I think there's something else in terms of, total funding of, individual infrastructure, that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, and I think
say, look, your insurance, can't make up this, so the taxpayers will.
Well, and I guess where I was going with that is perhaps a little flip, but there is a perception too, right? That hey, this is individual stuff, and I think there's also a perception that hey, this is a rich people's problem, to some extent, where they are. So the optics of that are even worse. I don't know that it's a politically viable thing necessarily, and certainly going forward with, a new administration starting in 3 days, I don't think there's going to be any political will at the federal level to, make people whole or better than whole, I guess as the case may be. But it does seem to me that, given that we're going to build back, where we are, this is going to be rebuilt. It seems like, not holding it to 1940 standards would be probably desirable. And I'm not sure how much more some of this costs. There was, I don't know if you saw the example, there was kind of this one new house that didn't burn, and it had been, architecturally, it was in the middle of it and everything was flattened. And, basically they had built it to be relatively fireproof. And sort of the architect seemed to indicate that most of what they did wasn't all that expensive, in terms of, I mean, it was things about, distance between property line and things, and, metal roof over shingles and things like that. And that, it costs a little bit more, but not having eaves and things like that. So I think, there are things and perhaps, you could make decisions that don't add a lot of cost that are an improvement. On the other hand, I have a feeling the response to this is going to be so fast that probably none of that's going to happen, would be, my suspicion, in terms of kind of best practice stuff.
Going to the deeper policy things, there was a story discussing power lines in California, and there was at one point, I should have pulled it all up in front of me, but there were power lines attached to wooden poles, old fashioned, that are more likely to snap and then cause sparks and cause fires. And the residents nearby had said, well, can we make these, build these into metal poles that are stronger, less likely to break and cause sparks, et cetera. And they couldn't, because in order to do that would have required tearing out and burning up or destroying habitat for native California flora, plants that grew in the area of the electric poles. And again, there's sort of those, California requirements that are mind-boggling. And, what can one do? Setting aside the idea that, one, how helpful is that protective statute, or to say that, listen, no, it's illegal to dig up this plant, this native plant, but now we've sort of burned it all away. And also, so anyway, but I mean, how does one confront those types of issues? And in that case, I think you can say, listen, there were some government policies here, which there could have been things that could have been done to reduce the risk of fires. You can't eliminate it completely, but government's about making trade-offs, and it's a matter of, well, if you got to tear up the plants to do this, that ought to maybe take fire prevention should maybe take priority over preserving native plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's.
And I'm not, again, to be clear, I'm not saying the fires happened because of that. I'm throwing that as one example of, here's a policy which might have mitigated fires and could mitigate future fires, but they're not able to. The same thing goes for water diversion to protect endangered species, that sort of thing. At some point, you have to make decisions as to which species you want to preserve. So,
well, I think two things. One, a small point, but there is a difference between burning plants and digging them up. Just in terms of they grow back when they burn. Typically, but I do agree with the point about trade-offs that you have certain priorities that you have to have. I'd throw on the water side of things, agriculture into the mix. That an awful lot of California water ends up growing almonds and alfalfa for export and things like that. And I think that is potentially a bigger issue than protecting smelt or whatever the fish was in terms of water usage. That so much of it go, and again, it's not something that you can necessarily. It's not an easy trade-off. People seem to like almonds and things like that. But I think there's kind of a lot of, there are certainly some policy things here, but oftentimes it's not only the environmental stuff.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. Yeah.
And I think maybe it's easier to kill the fish or dig up the plants.
Right. I'd rather lose the smelt, keep the almonds.
I'm not a huge almond fan, but
really?
They're kind of generic. But I'm not going to yuck your yum, on that. But I think there probably are broader water use considerations there. And I think in terms of impact, the agriculture is it's a lot bigger than so much of the environmental stuff. So anyway, should probably get towards moving on here, I think. But
well, no, yeah, absolutely.
For not being not being fire experts here, we've certainly had a fair amount to say.
Well, I mean, again, I don't know that it don't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind blows, Justin. And so a lot of this, to me, again, it's less about whether what policies can prevent fires or mitigate them, as to where have the discussions been about this, right? I guess that's sort of my take, is that it almost seems like this wasn't really discussed or a factor, and I think you're correct in pointing out that, as Milton Friedman said, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, and there's going to be trade-offs, and if you want more fire mitigation, maybe it is a compromise either on the environmental regs or on what essentially are subsidies to agriculture. And I think those are conversations to have, but I think they
probably should have the conversations.
Yeah, have the conversations and realize that there's going to be a cost and trade-off one way or the other. So, well, moving on, as the country is moving on, Donald Trump's nominees are moving quickly towards Senate confirmation, and he's actually working on some proposed legislation to put out and get rolling on that big first day next week. Most notably, I'd say, of the Trump cabinet nominees, Pete Hegseth, who I think, aside from the completely bizarre Matt Gaetz sort of thing that happened, seemed to be the most controversial, or at least most vulnerable, Trump nominee for Secretary of Defense, seems to have sailed through, or will sail through, committee unscathed, more or less. My overall impression was he did a good job in the hearings, which is sort of expected, and it sort of also plays into the Trump thing of, look, this is a guy who does TV, right? And he does it well. And I think in one of the shows with, I don't know, Justin, whether it was you or with Mike, that there's something about Trump that loves a TV star.
I think we had talked about this at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, if he's looking to pick people not as this person is an omnicompetent manager or a visionary in their field or whatever, but rather, look, he's my guy who's going to be loyal, and he can do a good job articulating the message. That's what I want as the face of the thing. I think that makes sense. So, the big holdout with Hegseth was where would Joni Ernst go? She had sort of kept her powder dry, indicating she'd wait till the hearings happened to make any sort of announcement about where she was leaning. And after the hearing, she announced that she was in favor of him. So your thoughts first on Hegseth, then I guess the next, it's impossible to hit them all.
Right.
Next would be Tulsi Gabbard, I think, would be the other one who is probably most vulnerable.
I'd throw RFK into the mix too, probably.
Oh, well, we can, but yeah, I think we absolutely should throw RFK into the mix. But yeah, so anyway, your thoughts on, let's start with those three, where they stand, because I think those are the three that are the most controversial. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right that Ernst was kind of the pivot point there, and I think that's an indicator. Once she's come out in favor of him, I don't really see a scenario where he doesn't get full confirmation from the Senate, and I think in some ways which
is something, because I would have a month ago I might have put the Hegseth thing at like a 50-50, 60-40 type situation.
Well, 50-50 happens half the time. So, yeah. But anyway, I don't know, honestly, that Ernst, she got a lot of attention, but she's not that independent. I certainly, it's one of those things where people, playing up that she's got military experience and she's a woman and, so on. But I can't think of a moment where she's ever really broken with Trump, frankly. And so I would have been surprised if this was sort of the moment. Yeah, I thought he did, fine in the hearings. He's telegenic and whatnot. We talked about him when he was announced. I think the last time we were on together was the week that this came out. And, I think he's a terrible pick, and continue to think he's a terrible pick, on the merits. This one, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think this is where we were the last time we talked about it, is that, he's loyal and he's, a good spokesman, for Trump and whatnot. But, if you look at kind of the various scandals around him, coupled with the just general lack of qualifications, John Tower got sunk years ago for being a womanizer with a drinking problem, and he was otherwise qualified. And this is somebody that has no, it's a loser on both fronts, from a policy standpoint or from a management standpoint. And frankly, the only thing he ever ran, he got run out of, the nonprofit for mismanaging it. So, I don't see a scenario where he's not confirmed at this point, and again, with kind of all of them, and we can talk about the other two, but I'm not sure what you would need to do at this point to not get confirmed, except DMAC.
Well, the RFK maybe
RFK maybe, and maybe Gabbard, but.
Well, I think Gabbard is safe now too. I think
probably so. But I think it is, and it's something that we've talked about before, and I think something on a lot of people's minds is, what's the Republican Party look like vis-a-vis Trump? They've got this small majority, in both the House and the Senate, and only the Senate's in play here, but they don't have a lot of wiggle room, and so there's this question, how unified are they going to be? And honestly, there's not too many that are squishy, and I don't think there was ever an expectation that there were too many that were squishy. But boy, just in general, this may be a harbinger that there's not going to be a whole lot of anybody in play, potentially down the road. So, I think Hegseth is probably a slam dunk at this point for confirmation. Heaven help us. Gabbard, I think, is a little more touch and go. Honestly. One is sort of an ex-Democrat. I don't think there's kind of any personal loyalty there, from people. Yeah. Not that we ever particularly liked her either, but it's funny. There were when I caucused here, there were 3 or 4 big Gabbard signs in the neighborhood. And at my precinct, literally nobody caucused for her at all. Like I never knew what her constituency was exactly. But I think, from not being kind of on the team, the whole time, there's maybe a little less. But I think there are, enough sort of concerns about her as a, kind of potential security risk in the past and things like that, that I do wonder if there aren't a handful of hardliners there that, might look past, incompetence or drinking or what have you, in one case. But maybe that is the step too far, for some of them. That said, I don't exactly know who it would be, at this point. And I don't know. Do you have thoughts on anybody that seems like they might?
No, like I said, I think Tulsi Gabbard gets through having sort of changed her position on some of the Section 702 intelligence gathering stuff that was a holdup for folks. So no, I think she does fine. And also, I would say this is a little weird, is that the DNI, I think, is also someone who is necessarily, or at least one would hope, less public than Secretary of Defense, right? I don't care to see the DNI on all the Sunday morning shows, except in sort of extraordinary circumstances. So there's something to that too. If this is a matter of her actually being a security risk, I think that's sort of a little far-fetched. I mean, there are security, background checks done on these, look on just your basic employees, and certainly nominees of, and if this troubles me a little bit, that if Democrats were willing to suggest that, listen, this person may in fact be treasonous, well, that's a whole other kettle of fish, isn't it? Right? It's not just sort of, hey, this isn't the best pick, or this person isn't qualified. That troubles me a lot, that she would somehow, whatever, give away the U.S. So that to me is beyond the pale in terms of arguments. Now you want to say, well, you shouldn't have met with Assad and so forth. No, I don't think you should have, but neither should have John Kerry. But that doesn't raise security concerns to me, right? That someone would actually give away.
I mean, those are more bad policy decisions.
Exactly. Yeah. It may show poor political judgment, but not, in terms of managerial stuff. So
I will say a couple other thoughts on her, and but I will say with, in terms of background checks, one thing that came out with the Hegseth was that, they would not share the background checks with the Democrats on the committee, and so, admittedly, some of this probably doesn't need to be public, but I have some concerns, about, what happens with those, in terms of sharing as useful information. I guess one other thought with Gabbard, again, I'm a little mystified by the choice. Just again, in terms of sort of qualifications, she was kind of nobody. I mean, she was really a backbencher, during her time in the House. So, this is another one where I'm just sort of mystified, where this pick comes from, except that, she kind of came out for Trump in the end, which,
well, I think it
I guess is enough.
Yeah. No, I think it comes from, Trump is very distrustful of the deep state, especially the intelligence deep state, and sort of after what he went through. He sees people as, like James Clapper, as do I, as really folks who have improperly used their office for partisan and political purposes. And he's, in my ideal, right, the DNI would on all our intelligence agencies, would be completely nonpartisan, completely non-political, and just play it straight and say, here's the information. Trump I think is acting in sort of a realist, as that's not the world we live in right now, or hasn't been at least. And if you're going to have a partisan in that position, well, it might as well be mine. And I don't think that's an unreasonable calculation, right?
Well, I mean, everybody picks their own people,
Well, yeah, you'd hope, but there's this weird sort of thing of weird sort of chorus in the media of, of there's these complaints that Trump is picking all these loyalists to fill his cabinet. Well, of course you do. I mean, I think that's why. Why would you pick someone who's disloyal? I mean, I think there's something to that will have, Trump sees this, and in a lot of cases, rightfully so, right? As people who are coming out of the administrative state are not his friends, so he's going to pick people who are political people. So that's just his, or at least very public people, right? Because for example, in these kind of positions, like with the intelligence services, typically what you would get is not someone who has a political reputation, but came up through the ranks administratively, and is someone in most cases you've never heard of, right? I mean, you wouldn't never have heard of. Now, I guess maybe the exception is maybe someone like a Leon Panetta, but again, Panetta came out of his wife, White House chief of staff, right? That he served in various elected positions as well, but he was still an administrative kind of person when he was tapped to head the CIA. So I think that's Trump's thinking in this is he wants public people as opposed to agency insiders.
Yeah, which
that's her qualification. Yeah, is one, they're for him and loyal to him, and two, they are public facing.
It also makes me wonder, how much influence does she actually end up having?
I would tend to agree with that. Yeah.
Is she just kind of a front for Kash Patel in the end, or something like that? Is she just kind of a figurehead and whatnot? But yeah.
So I think that is. I think we're on the same page analysis wise there. So RFK, your thoughts there? What happens next? Because Trump has been sort of downplaying some of the RFK anti-vax rhetoric of the past, and sort of trying to reassure folks of no, he's not like that anymore. So your thoughts on where the RFK pick goes?
Yeah, again here it's it's a narrow margin. I don't know if you get anybody to, well, there are a couple things, I guess. One, I don't know if he's done anything enough that any Republicans are going to buck the president on this. There is potentially the issue as well that, there are a handful of Democrats that seem okay with him or less opposed. Fetterman, in particular seems, RFK curious, at least. And so, I mean, this could be one where you might even see a couple Democrats, vote for him. Interestingly, he's the one. There's just a poll that came out this week, and I can't remember who did it. It should take better notes, but kind of across a number of nominees, he was basically, for as much as we talk about this stuff, I have to be reminded that most of the public isn't paying attention. I think for Hegseth and Gabbard both, I think the majority response was no opinion and don't know who this person is, more or less. But of those that knew, like, both were sort of slightly underwater. RFK was actually a little more popular with the public. Like, people knew who he was and had close to 50-50 among those that had a response. So I don't know if there's, in terms of public pressure, I don't know how much public pressure comes to bear on these things. I think he's been overshadowed a little bit, by the other nominees. I feel like the Hegseth is interesting, actually, and we're not really going to cover him either, but, how little attention Rubio got. It was all kind of Hegseth this week.
Well, I think partially because Rubio was sort of a known quantity and is seen as a not, let's put it this way. When Marco Rubio was nominated, no one said, wow, that's nuts, or geez, that's, what I mean?
Yeah,
I think most people say, look, you can agree or disagree, or maybe he wouldn't be your first choice, but
I was
it
going to say
wasn't really a question of qualifications or.
Yeah,
or
we talked about him the last time I was on, and that's I think where we both landed. It was different attitudes towards him, but yeah, this is within the realm of normal. It was I think where we landed.
Yeah. If anything, I would say Rubio is probably the most establishment almost of all of Trump's picks. Maybe not most establishment.
I don't know if there's any doubt about that. I looking at the rest of them, but back to RFK, Trump's kind of downplayed that, but when you're having to have a conversation like, yes, there will still be MMR shots, and yes, there will still be polio shots and things like that. That's not the kind of conversation we want to be having, around these things. I think it's something that if Democrats want to stop him, and I think he might be a little vulnerable, they're really going to have to play this up. Certainly, there are anti-vax constituencies out there, but for gosh sakes, most people vaccinate their kids. Pretty much everything he's got is just quackery. I mean, they just grab, with the caveat that I'm not that kind of doctor. None of his positions are anything that are mainstream, medical kind of stuff. And again, I don't know, what kind of, how active he would be in running this, but it seems like you could, if Democrats really wanted to push back, you could make a pretty strong case that people would understand that might be enough, just to sway a few sort of purple state senators. People, they can relate to some of the medical stuff. I think foreign policy is such an abstraction that, that for the most part, this is going to fly over people's heads or off the radar. There's some real concrete stuff here with RFK. Whether or not they're going to push on that, and I think the kind of thinking a little more meta, the overall kind of Trump strategy, and he's said this pretty publicly, is kind of shock and awe on day one and overwhelm things, which I think makes it very hard. There's a limited amount of bandwidth that Democrats have to push back on things. Whether they have the bandwidth to do RFK, I don't know. In terms of, I mean, there's just so much happening in the next, 3 days and weeks and 4 years. That
there is something now. If you're thinking in completely Machiavellian terms, which is how I typically think.
And you've accused me of that as well, and probably true. Yes.
If I'm a Democrat, by all means, RFK Jr. RFK Jr. will be, I would anticipate, the gift that keeps on giving. So I think there could be something to that, right? Too, that there you could have in any given news cycle. Well, here's the goofy thing that RFK said or did last week, and we'll see how that plays out. I mean, maybe he gets into office and becomes incredibly disciplined, and I don't know. My sense is not, but.
They're going to have a full-time staffer to keep whale carcasses off his car.
Well, exactly, yeah. And again, if I'm on the Senate committee, my question would have been, like, so you put the dead bear back in the backseat of your car? Yes, Senator. Because you were going to eat it?
This is where I wish it was. This is where I wish this was a video medium on occasion, because the face I'm making right now is just unreal. I mean, I don't even have anything to say to that. I'm just, furrowed brow. And the other thought, is, I mean, Trump had pretty high staffing turnover. I don't know how long any of these people last.
I agree there. I think RFK may be the first to go.
Yeah, and I don't know, honestly. I mean, he's crusaded on these things, but I don't know how interested he is in actually doing anything, in reality. So, but I think, kind of across the board with all of these, I mean, the next version of this, we can, start a betting pool of, who's the first to go and by when, and I'm not sure how long any of these stick around is, sort of the other element of this, but.
Yeah. So I think there's something else that RFK, I think, brings to the table and that is just from Trump, and that the nominee, regardless of the policy, is the message, right? And the message is skepticism as to the medical establishment, right? He's in many ways kind of the anti-Fauci for good and bad, across the board. Because I do think and I think Democrats still underestimate this. What happened during COVID? I think there's a tremendous backlash. There can be plenty of people, I think, who are not anti-vaxxers in terms of, listen, they've had their kids vaccinated for whatever, polio, rubella, and mumps and measles, all the usual stuff, right? And they get a flu shot every year, but all of a sudden, there's a new vaccine that hasn't really been tested just by necessity, right? Because of the speed at which it had to be developed, based on new technology, based on technology to which some people have religious objections. and you've got all of a sudden the government saying you have to take this vaccine, and making statements on the one hand of, that you do this and you won't get COVID and you can't spread COVID, which turned out to be, as Biden likes to call it, disinformation. I think there is a constituency out there that says, listen, it's good to have a skeptic, even if he's nuts, right? Look, he may be, nuts on it, but it's good to have someone asking questions, or at least not, I guess that's my take. That's my take with the RFK nomination. The more
I think, more broadly speaking, and I mean, I think this is some of the Trump constituency, is there are just people who are sort of contrarian in general. You do your own research crowd, which, as somebody who does research, that gets under my skin. But
why? No, I'm curious. Why does that?
Oh, because the people.
I would think you'd want to encourage more people to do their own.
Because
research.
The people that do their own research, like it's like watching BS on YouTube and things like that. What they count as research is not research, and in terms of grabbing onto one outlier and things like that, there are ways that you do research, and the people that especially during COVID, I mean, it was, here's some quack, somewhere that had this thing with 3 patients and whatnot.
Sure.
So I think it's me being a snob, I suppose, but I know how
that was going to be my point. Yes, but go ahead.
I own it. But, as somebody with a degree in research methodology, I have a fair amount of faith in things like epidemiology and drug trials and, things like that. And, being also terminally online, there's a ton of confirmation bias that goes on, and people are going to just grab onto, whatever thing that they want, whether they have the capacity to evaluate kind of quality research or not. Because even things that are passed off as research, some are good and some are poorly done and whatnot. So that's a rant, but
anyway. No, I appreciate it. I invited the rant.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I wouldn't say it's a counter rant. My counterpoint to it maybe is that I think you're right. Sure, there's all kinds of bad research and quackery out there. But the more fundamental issue I get to is the one, one of these conservative bedrock principles is that human nature has no history. And you can have all the research in the world. It can be conducted to the most rigorous standards. But if you've got somebody at the top who is not particularly honest or is willing to bend that to their own political purposes, it doesn't really do you any good, right? That's sort of why there's sort of the inherent, whether you want to call it conservative or populist, distrust of the technocrats, right? That the idea, and then this is the idea when we're maybe wandering into bonus show type stuff, but the original progressives, back in the teens and early 20s, the whole idea of, look, the best and brightest in government by science and all this sort of thing.
Oh, that makes my heart go
which sounds good. exactly, which sounds good on paper. But I think there's a difference between government by science and government by scientists, because you sort of assume that the scientists don't have the same aren't hewn from the same crooked timber of humanity as the rest of us. So anyway,
I think as a rejoinder to that, though, and then I've got maybe one other thought back to the RFK. But on the other hand, hey, if everybody's hewn from crooked timber, at least I'd like somebody that's qualified. If we're all falling,
good. In crooked timber,
if we're all falling, at least I feel like somebody that doesn't have a medical degree from the School of Hard Knocks has a better shot at getting things right. Back to kind of where we got off on this tangent a little bit, and gosh, I do enjoy tangents. But the weird thing to me with RFK and Trump a little bit, and this I guess maybe
aside from the bear and the whale, but yeah, go ahead.
The number of anyway, yeah, and this has been Trump kind of really going back to 2020. One of the few things that I actually give Trump a lot of credit for was fast tracking the vaccines.
Yeah.
I don't give him credit for much, but I think that was actually really good policy. And,
I agree with you.
And even if they're not, perfect vaccines, it certainly seems to be better than nothing and such. But that he almost immediately ran from it. If you throw, and even in the moment, he was getting pushback from MAGA that, he's not MAGA enough.
Yeah.
There was this weird, when is Trump not Trumpy enough for the Trumpsters? And, he was getting some pushback there and, then really walked away from what I thought was a pretty solid accomplishment. I mean, cooking up that vaccine and getting it distributed on that time frame was frankly quite impressive. And there was just a story this week that RFK, tried to petition to get approval withdrawn for the COVID vaccines. So you've got somebody here who, and I guess maybe it's just the politics of it with Trump's constituencies, but you get somebody here who is actually going against some of Trump's own successful policies, which just kind of boggles on some level. But
yeah, so my interpretation of that is, on the one hand, he was Operation Warp Speeding, and the vaccine, if you remember, I think was mostly, rolled out after he was defeated, right?
I'm trying to think when I got my shot.
Vaccines became available generally, I think I would say December-ish of 2020.
That's probably about right.
And I think to the general public, it was probably more March, April, spring of 2021. And there was a shift there between, hey, there's a vaccine, it's great, you might want to take this, to you must take this. And I think that is a significant shift. And Democrats often have the problem of anything that might be good, therefore ought to be mandatory. And I think that was the issue. And people will argue, well, Biden never said you had to take it, or, well, no, he did say that to service members, to military contractors. And that message was sort of received loud and clear by corporate America. People who said, you have to take this vaccine or you lose your job. And all of a sudden, I think that's when things changed a little bit, in terms of not the, hey, there's this vaccine available, maybe you can get the information, talk to your doctor, what to take it or don't, to you must take it. And again, the reasoning behind the you must take it was, well, if you take it, we can reopen the economy because this will stop the spread. But that wasn't really the case. And Biden knew that. And, well, I shouldn't say Biden knew that, but someone knew that. And that's what fueled the distrust, right? It's not. And so if you're Trump, then you, at that point, sort of do have to run away, walk away, because it's you fast track the vaccine, and then all of a sudden it's a different regime. I think if Trump had been reelected in 2020, you wouldn't have seen that same enforcement regime. I think you would have seen, we got a new vaccine. It's great. It's beautiful. It's the best beautiful vaccine we've ever had. You should take it, right? But I don't think you would have seen the mandates. which to my libertarian soul is all the difference in the world.
I guess, it'd be, boy, this is an interesting research question. At least anecdotally, around here, really, there was a lot of pushback before any talk of anything being mandatory. Thinking about kind of when I got mine, I figured out you couldn't get them where I am, but I figured out that if you went to a small town like half an hour from here, they couldn't give them away. And that was before any of that, any sort of policy thing.
Well, and I think that is sort of MAGA being Trumpier than Trump. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we called every day, early on to get one. And, this is where me being fat was an advantage that put me kind of, up the list. Save my
Did you tell people that? Like, look, I'm really fat.
Yeah. Fat middle-aged guy, give me a shot. And that was not enough around here, but I'll be darned if you went to Waverly, gosh, not only did they have all the slots open, but we got there and we got them like 45 minutes early because nobody had shown up for the early ones. So, I feel like that, I think your story is in some ways right, that it does exacerbate it. But I feel like there was a lot of more skepticism from the get-go, than kind of that. I don't think it's just kind of the mandatory element.
Well, but isn't that to be expected? Again, just with the speed that it was developed and
fair enough.
The lack of time. And again, it's one of those. I'm not faulting anyone because this was an emergency, but most vaccines you have years and years and years of testing, and perhaps there is a side effect where after on this one, after the second year you turn into a werewolf or something, and it's just why there were people who could make that decision of, look, I don't think this has been tested enough. And even the FDA itself, right, only approved it for the, immediate emergency usage at that point. And there were also, I think, sincere religious objections on some fronts. But yeah, I think.
But then to pull it back to RFK, I mean, he's going after all of these things that aren't that. It's not just the COVID vaccine. It's.
But to me, the message is skepticism. Right. It's not. And look, he can, people say, look, could say, yes, this guy is nuts to be skeptical of all these other things, which have been proven and tested for decades, 70, 80 years. Right.
Right.
But, they say, well, but you know what? Maybe he does have a point on the one that just came out last year, or 2 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yeah. I guess, then back to kind of where we started. I don't know. I'd put him probably closer to 50-50, for confirmation. I think of the three, he's probably the least likely, would be my suspicion. But, from what we've seen so far, the Republicans seem pretty united around Trump. So I don't know if, I don't know if anybody's going to buck him.
I think everybody wins with RFK. Trump gets his pick. He gets his shaking up of the establishment. Democrats get someone who will say something goofy on a pretty regular basis, and everybody wins for a while. And I think maybe Trump fires him after the first year.
I think that's a plausible story. I don't think anybody on the Republican side, whatever private objections they have, I have a suspicion that they're not strong enough objections to
right. To me, this is one of those
if I'm a Republican, do I care enough to burn a bridge with Trump? Who
right to borrow a sort of medical metaphor, this is sort of a virus that will sort of burn itself out.
Right, and just given his propensity to hold grudges and whatnot, is this the one where if I get one,
yes.
Is this where
RFK will self-destruct within a year or whatever, and yeah. That would be my political analysis if I were in the Senate. So,
yeah, that's I think pretty plausible. So Anyway,
so well that brings us to a close of the this edition of the Politics Guys, our regular show. We hope you'll tune in for our bonus show. If you are a subscriber, that is included in your package. If there was anything we discussed on this episode that you disagreed with, or that you have a question about, or you really liked, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X. Links are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion group forum for supporters, which Mike is on all the time because, unlike me, he's retired. If you're not really a supporter of the Politics Guys, we hope you'll consider becoming one to help us keep the show going strong. As a supporter, you'll get ad-free versions of everything we release, the full-length midweek episode instead of a preview, access to our Politics Guys Discord group where you can interact with Mike, Trey, and other listeners, and you'll even have the opportunity to listen in and comment as we record the show. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. If a monthly Patreon contribution is too much of a commitment, you've got issues with Patreon, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, we have PayPal and Venmo support options too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email Mike at politicsguys.com, and he will be happy to get that set up for you. Whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as share episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and we hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.